Harlem, spring, 1970. A Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that looks like every other morning. Delivery trucks on Lenox Avenue. The smell of frying fish from the soul food counter on 116th Street. Numbers runners making their early rounds before the legitimate world wakes up to its own business. At 8:47 a.m., a man named Carmine walks into a barbershop on 125th Street. He is not there for a haircut. He has not been in that chair in 15 years. Carmine is a collector. He works for the Genovese family. Every Tuesday morning, for 11 years, Carmine has walked into this barbershop and walked out with an envelope. The envelope contains $300. It is called, in the language of the arrangement, a service fee. It pays for protection, not from criminals, but from the Genovese family itself. The protection is from Carmine. The fee ensures that Carmine does not break anything, does not threaten anyone, does not create problems that are worse than $300. The barbershop owner, a man named Curtis Webb, has been paying this fee since 1959. He has calculated, across those 11 years, that he has paid Carmine and his predecessors approximately $17,000 for the privilege of running his own business in his own neighborhood. On this Tuesday morning in the spring of 1970, Curtis Webb hands Carmine the envelope. Carmine opens it. Inside, a piece of paper. Folded once, Carmine unfolds it. 4 words, written in careful block letters. This arrangement is over. Carmine looks up. Curtis Webb is behind the counter, hands folded, face completely neutral. "What is this?" Carmine says. "It's what it says," Curtis tells him. "You understand what happens if—" "Nothing happens," Curtis says. "Nothing is going to happen to me or my shop. You can go back and tell them that Frank Lucas said so." Carmine stands in the barbershop for a moment. Then he folds the paper, puts it in his jacket pocket, and leaves. He does not come back the following Tuesday. He does not come back the Tuesday after that. He never comes back. And in the weeks that follow, across dozens of businesses in Harlem, barbershops and beauty parlors and restaurants and numbers operations and laundromats and bodegas and every other enterprise that had been paying the Genovese family its weekly tribute, the same conversation happens, in variations, with different collectors and different business owners. The envelopes stop. The collectors stop coming. The tax, the Harlem tax that the Italian mob had been collecting for decades, the $300 here and $500 there, and $1,000 somewhere else that added up, across hundreds of businesses, to millions of dollars annually extracted from a neighborhood that could least afford to lose it, simply ends. Not through negotiation, not through a peace summit or a sit-down or a carefully brokered territorial agreement. Through a decision. Frank Lucas's decision. Delivered not through violence, but through 4 words on a piece of paper. This arrangement is over. The Italian mob, which had not backed down from anyone in living memory, did not respond. The question that nobody asked out loud, the question that every business owner in Harlem was asking quietly, privately, in the specific silence of people trying to understand something that contradicts everything they thought they knew, was this. Why? Why did the Genovese family, which had killed people for far less, simply stop? The answer is the story of the most consequential power shift in Harlem's history. And it begins not in 1970, but 20 years earlier, with a lesson Frank Lucas learned from a dead man. To understand what Frank Lucas ended, you need to understand how it started. The Italian mob's presence in Harlem was not, historically speaking, the result of conquest. It was the result of something more insidious. Invitation. In the 1920s and 1930s, as Harlem established itself as the cultural capital of Black America, the neighborhood's underground economy, the numbers racket, the speakeasies, the entertainment industry that ran alongside and beneath the legitimate one, was growing faster than any single black operator could manage. The Great Migration was bringing hundreds of thousands of people north. The money was real, the market was enormous, and the infrastructure to serve it was being built on the fly, without the organizational depth or the political protection that an established criminal enterprise would have. The Italian mob moved in not as conquerors but as partners, or as what passed for partners in that particular world. They provided capital, organizational muscle, and political connections that the emerging black criminal class lacked. In exchange, they took a percentage of everything. The percentage, over time, became the tax. It was never formalized. There was no contract, no negotiated rate, no institutional arrangement that could be audited or appealed. It was simply the way things worked. You operated a business in Harlem, you paid. The amount was set by whoever came to collect it, calibrated to what the business could bear while leaving enough profit to keep the business running. The tax was, in this sense, parasitic in the technical meaning. It extracted value without killing the host. By the 1940s, the tax was deeply embedded in Harlem's economic life. It was part of the cost of doing business, as fixed and as unavoidable as rent or electricity. Business owners who tried to refuse it discovered quickly that the consequences were worse than the payment. Business owners who paid it discovered that the protection it theoretically provided was real in one narrow sense. Carmine and his colleagues did not break anything in shops that were paying. What the tax did not protect against was everything else. The economic discrimination that kept black businesses from accessing legitimate capital. The racist policing that treated black business owners as suspects rather than citizens. The systematic exclusion from the political processes that shaped the neighborhood's development. Against all of this, the tax provided nothing. It was payment for the privilege of being left alone by one particular set of wolves in a neighborhood full of wolves. Bumpy Johnson had understood this dynamic clearly. He had spent his career navigating it, building enough power to limit the tax's reach, protecting certain operations from its worst effects, maintaining relationships with the Italian families that kept the extraction from becoming outright destruction. But even Bumpy, at the height of his power, had not eliminated the tax. He had managed it, worked around it, established an equilibrium. Frank Lucas had watched Bumpy manage the equilibrium for 20 years, and he had concluded that equilibrium was not the right goal. The question of why Frank Lucas could end the Harlem tax when Bumpy Johnson, who was, by any measure, at least as formidable an operator, could not is the central strategic question of this story. The answer is structural, and it connects directly to the Blue Magic operation. Bumpy Johnson's power in Harlem rested on a foundation that, however impressive in its construction, had a fundamental vulnerability. It depended on the Italian mob for supply. Bumpy's numbers operation, his enforcement capacity, his political connections, all of it was real. But the one thing Bumpy could not do was source his own product. The heroin that moved through Harlem in the 1950s and 1960s came through Italian-controlled supply chains. Bumpy could distribute. He could manage the street-level operation with extraordinary sophistication. But he was, at the foundational level of the supply chain, dependent on the families he was also trying to resist. This dependency created leverage. Not leverage that the families exercised crudely. Bumpy was too valuable as a distribution channel for that. But leverage that was real and structural. Bumpy could push back against the tax, could negotiate its terms, could establish a more favorable equilibrium. But he could not eliminate it, because eliminating it would risk the supply relationship that his entire operation required. Frank Lucas had removed this dependency. By 1970, Frank Lucas was sourcing directly from Southeast Asia. He had eliminated the Italian middlemen from his supply chain entirely. The product that became Blue Magic traveled from the Golden Triangle to New York through mechanisms that had nothing to do with the Genovese family, or the Gambinos, or any of the other families that had controlled Harlem's drug supply for decades. This meant something that had never been true before in Harlem's criminal history. A major black operator had no structural dependency on the Italian mob. Frank Lucas did not need what they had, and a man who does not need what you have cannot be leveraged through the threat of withholding it. The Italian families had managed Harlem's black criminal operators through a combination of supply control, violence, and the implicit threat that resistance would cost more than compliance. This system worked because all three elements were real. They controlled supply, they could apply violence, and they had demonstrated, historically, that resistance was costly. Frank Lucas's operation broke the first element. He controlled his own supply. This did not eliminate the other two elements. The families could still apply violence, and resistance still carried costs. But it changed the fundamental calculus in ways that were, for the Italian families, deeply disorienting. You cannot threaten to cut off a man's supply if he doesn't use your supply. You can threaten violence, But violence against Frank Lucas in 1970 was not the simple calculation it might have been against the less established operator. Frank Lucas had resources, financial, organizational, and in terms of the specific, credible capacity for retaliatory violence, that made the cost-benefit analysis of direct confrontation genuinely unfavorable. The families did the math. The math said, this man does not need us, he can absorb or respond to our violence, and the territory he controls is generating revenue that, if we go to war with him, we will lose while spending money we would rather spend on easier problems. The math said, let Harlem go. Frank Lucas understood that this was the conclusion they would reach. He had been working toward this moment for years, not just through the blue magic sourcing, but through the deliberate construction of an operation that was, by 1970, large enough and capable enough that the families had to take it seriously as a retaliatory threat. The tax didn't end because Frank Lucas made a threat. It ended because he had built something that made the threat unnecessary to articulate. The 4 words on the piece of paper, "This arrangement is over," were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a notification. The Italian mob already knew the arrangement was over. Frank Lucas was simply formalizing what the power dynamics had already determined. Here is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple narrative of liberation. When the tax stopped, Harlem's businesses kept the money that had been going to Carmine and his colleagues. This was real. Curtis Webb's barbershop kept $300 a week that it had been paying to the Genovese family. Multiply that across hundreds of businesses, across a neighborhood, and the dollar amount is significant. Capital that had been extracted from Harlem and transferred to Italian-controlled coffers stayed in the neighborhood. This is unambiguously positive. The extraction of capital from an already impoverished community for no legitimate purpose by an outside force, this is simply predation. Its end is simply good. But here is what else happened. The Italian mob's tax, whatever its origins and however unjust its mechanisms, had served a particular function in Harlem's underground economy. It was a known quantity. Businesses knew what they owed. They knew who to pay. They knew what the payment bought. The arrangement was exploitative, but it was legible. It had a structure that businesses could plan around. When Frank Lucas ended the tax, he did not create a vacuum. He filled it, not with his own collection operation. Frank Lucas was not interested in running a protection racket. That was not his business model. But the relationships that the ending of the Italian tax created, the obligations that Harlem's business community felt toward the man who had ended it, the informal authority that the act conferred, the specific kind of social capital that accrues to someone who does a neighborhood a significant favor, all of this was real. Frank Lucas did not collect a formal tax, but he collected something. He collected permission, cooperation, the specific willingness of a community to look away from things it might otherwise have looked at more directly. When Frank Lucas needed things, information, cooperation, the willingness of certain people to see nothing and say nothing, he found the community more forthcoming than it might otherwise have been. The ending of the tax had created a credit. Frank Lucas drew on that credit. This is not a simple story of exploitation. The community genuinely benefited from the ending of the Italian tax. The credit was genuinely earned. Frank Lucas had done something real for Harlem. But the credit was drawn against blue magic. The willingness to see nothing, to cooperate with the invisible empire, to extend to Frank Lucas the benefit of the doubt that the community had not extended to the Italian collectors. This willingness made it easier for the blue magic operation to run. Made it easier for the product that was destroying Harlem's young people to move through the neighborhood. Made it easier for the devastation to continue. The economic liberation was real. The cost of the economic liberation was also real. And it was paid, as costs in Harlem's history so often were, by the people with the least capacity to bear it. The Italian mob's withdrawal from Harlem was not immediate or total. Frank Lucas's notification, delivered through Curtis Webb's barbershop and dozens of similar conversations across the neighborhood, was not universally accepted without response. 3 incidents in the weeks following the initial notification tested the new arrangement. The first was a visit to a numbers operation on 118th Street. 2 men, not Carmine, but men of similar purpose, arrived on a Wednesday morning and made clear that the arrangement was not over, whatever Frank Lucas had decided, and that the $500 weekly payment needed to resume. The number's operation owner called a number. Within 4 hours, the two visitors were in a hospital in the Bronx. Their injuries were not life-threatening. They were specific, deliberate, calibrated to communicate a message without triggering a full escalation. The message: this is what disagreeing with Frank Lucas's notification costs. The second incident involved a more senior emissary, a capo from the Genovese family, sent to request a sit-down with Frank Lucas to discuss the new arrangements. The request was transmitted through intermediaries, carefully worded, framed as an invitation to negotiate rather than a demand for compliance. Frank Lucas agreed to the sit-down. He arrived alone, sat down across from the capo and his associates, listened to the capo's opening, a careful, diplomatic articulation of the family's interest in maintaining the traditional arrangements that have served everyone well. Frank Lucas let him finish. Then he explained, in the same quiet, conversational tone that characterized all his serious communications, that there were no traditional arrangements anymore, that Harlem was not a territory the family had any claim on, that the businesses in Harlem were no longer paying tribute, that this was not a negotiating position, it was a description of reality. The capo asked what Frank Lucas was prepared to offer in exchange for this new reality. Frank Lucas said he was not prepared to offer anything. He was not buying Harlem from the family. Harlem had never been theirs to sell. The capo left. The family consulted, assessed the situation, considered their options. The third incident, and this is the one that made the decision for them, was not a confrontation. It was information. The families had, by this point, a reasonably complete picture of what Frank Lucas had built. They understood the sourcing. They understood the distribution network. They understood the financial scale of the operation. They understood, with the clarity that comes from professional assessment rather than pride or emotion, that Frank Lucas's operation was genuinely beyond their ability to simply crush. This was not something the Italian families had encountered before. They had encountered black operators who were too expensive to fight in the short term, but could eventually be brought to heel. They had not encountered a black operator who had removed the structural dependency that made bringing to heel possible. Frank Lucas could not be starved out. He had his own supply. Frank Lucas could not be economically isolated. He had his own financial structure. Frank Lucas could not be intimidated through the conventional means of mob pressure. He had demonstrated, clearly and specifically, that pressure would be answered with precisely calibrated counterpressure. The families made a decision that Carlo Gambino, in the various accounts of this period, articulated more clearly than most. Some wars cost more than the territory is worth. Harlem, without the tax, without the supply chain dominance, without the structural dependency that made the neighborhood's operators manageable, Harlem was not worth the war that taking it from Frank Lucas would require. They withdrew. Not publicly, not formally, not with any announcement or ceremony. They simply stopped coming to collect. The tax ended, and Frank Lucas, in the specific quiet of having won something without fully fighting for it, returned to the barbershop on 125th Street. Curtis Webb looked up from behind the counter. "Carmine's not coming back," Frank said. It was not a question. "No," Curtis said. "He's not." Frank Lucas nodded. Sat down in a chair by the window. "Not the barber's chair, just a chair." "Good," he said. He didn't stay long. He had other things to attend to. He always had other things to attend to. But for that moment, in that barbershop, something had been accomplished that Harlem's black criminal operators had been working toward for decades. Something that Bumpy Johnson, who had given his life to the neighborhood and its interests, had never quite managed. The Harlem tax was over. Frank Lucas had done it. And now, with that victory secured, he went back to flooding the neighborhood with heroin. This is where the story demands the hardest accounting. Frank Lucas ended the Harlem tax. This was a genuine economic benefit to the neighborhood. Capital stayed in Harlem that had previously been extracted. Business owners who had been paying $300 or $500 or $1,000 a week to the Italian mob now kept that money. The aggregate effect on Harlem's underground economy was real and positive. Frank Lucas simultaneously ran an operation that moved heroin of extraordinary purity through those same businesses, through those same streets, into those same communities. The economic logic of the two things, the liberation and the predation, cannot be separated. They were funded by the same operation, executed by the same organization, directed by the same man. The money that made it possible for Frank Lucas to tell the Italian mob that Harlem was no longer theirs came from blue magic. The power that backed up that declaration came from an organization built on the heroin trade. The liberation was real. The liberation was paid for with poison. This is not a paradox that resolves. It is a genuine moral complexity, the kind that history is full of and that simple narratives of hero or villain cannot accommodate. The Italian mob's tax was extraction. It took money from Harlem and gave nothing back except the temporary absence of Carmine. Frank Lucas's operation was also extraction. It took money from Harlem's most vulnerable people, the addicted, the desperate, the young men with no better options, and gave back, in its complicated way, some of what it took. The difference between the two extractions is not moral. Both were predatory. Both imposed costs on a community that had not chosen them and could not avoid them. The difference is narrative. Frank Lucas's extraction had a story attached to it that the Italian mob's tax did not. The story of the man who stood up to the families. The story of Harlem's liberation from outside control. The story of black economic power asserted against the structures that had suppressed it. The story was true. And the story was used to build the community credit that Frank Lucas drew against. Used to maintain the willingness to see nothing that his operation depended on. Used to sustain, for years longer than it otherwise might have lasted, an empire that was destroying the community it claimed to have liberated. Curtis Webb's barbershop kept its $300 a week. Curtis Webb's nephew died of a heroin overdose in 1973. Both of these things are true. They happened in the same neighborhood. They were produced by the same man. They cannot be separated. The ending of the Harlem tax in 1970 is one of the least documented and most consequential events in Harlem's 20th century history. It is underdocumented because it happened quietly, without violence, without a formal announcement, through the specific mechanism of envelopes that stopped and collectors who didn't return. It left no paper trail, no court records, no journalistic account. It was, in its way, as invisible as Frank Lucas himself. It was consequential because it represented a genuine shift in the power dynamics of New York's criminal landscape. The first time in modern history that a black criminal operator had successfully asserted territorial control against the Italian mob without a protracted violent conflict. The methods matter here. Frank Lucas did not end the tax through violence. He ended it through structural power, through having built an operation that was genuinely independent of the Italian supply chain, genuinely capable of absorbing or answering Italian retaliation, and genuinely more valuable to its principles than the cost of the war that taking it would require. This is, by any measure, a remarkable achievement. It required years of preparation, the Southeast Asian sourcing, the country boys' distribution architecture, the financial independence, that were oriented, among other things, toward this specific strategic goal. Frank Lucas wanted Harlem to be free of the Italian tax. He built the thing that made that freedom possible. He achieved it. The legacy of that achievement sits permanently alongside the legacy of what achieved it. You cannot separate Harlem's economic liberation from blue magic. They are the same story, told by the same man, funded by the same operation. The barbershop kept its $300. The neighborhood paid in something that cannot be counted in dollars. Frank Lucas understood both of these things. He was not a man who failed to understand the full picture of what he was doing. He was a man who looked at the full picture and made choices. The choice to end the tax was real. The good it did was real. The choice to continue the operation that made the tax ending possible, that choice was also real. And its costs are still being counted. In Harlem. In the families that absorbed the devastation. In the community that received its economic liberation and its poison from the same hand. Frank Lucas told the Italian mob, Harlem is not yours anymore. He was right. By 1973, Harlem belonged to Frank Lucas. And Frank Lucas belonged to Blue Magic. And Blue Magic belonged to no one, least of all to the neighborhood that was paying for it with everything it had.